So we've already covered some of the basics about learning, and now we get to go in a little deeper. We get to talk about classical conditioning. We get to talk about operant conditioning. We get to talk about dogs and pigeons. I already told you about those in a previous chapter, so some of these names will sound really familiar. The first one we're going to talk about is Ivan Pavlov. And as you'll remember, Ivan had these dogs. Now, he didn't wake up one day and go, I think I'm going to figure out how dogs learn. He was actually doing a different study, and in the process, he discovered what then became known as classical conditioning. He would bring the food in, and he would open the door and walk down the hall and into the kennel where the dogs were. He'd put the food bowl down, and they began to recognize that the food bowl had this food in it. And so when they saw the food bowl, they would naturally, as dogs do, start salivating because they liked the food. But then they started also associating, when they heard the door open, this sound triggered this, oh my gosh, the food is coming. And he noticed over time that as soon as the door sound happened, they started salivating. Now, frequently you'll understand that went with a ringing. There was a bell attached to the door, and that's why we think that bell ringing creates salivation in dogs. So when we talk about the process, what we're looking at is this idea that before conditioning began, the unconditioned stimulus is the food. The food comes in and the dog naturally salivates because there's this biological component related to food and the way that our body gets ready for that consumption. And also the bodies of dogs get ready for that consumption. However, during the whole process, what happens in this is the door sound and the food become paired. And so what we have is a general neutral stimulus, the door sound, now is paired with this unconditioned stimulus, and you get an unconditioned response. So that what we have first is an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response, because those are just natural relationships. But during the conditioning, your unconditioned stimulus starts pairing with a neutral stimulus. Now your neutral stimulus becomes your conditioned stimulus because the association is made. And the conditioned stimulus also creates a response, but now it's a conditioned response. So we start off with unconditioned stimuli, and then unconditioned responses, and then there is a transformation in this whole process of learning that then gets a conditioned stimulus and a conditioned response. When we think about classical conditioning, we also want to be aware that as we do those pairings of unconditioned stimuli with a neutral stimuli to become a part of this whole cycle, there is a great deal of strength if there's regular associations. If we stop that whole association, so the food doesn't show up, the door keeps opening and there's the sound associated with it, but there's no reward of the food, then the learning starts to become extinguished. That pairing gets broken. However, as soon as that food comes through the door again, you have what's called a spontaneous recovery, and that you can go back up to the same level of association or nearly the same level of association. Now, why is this important? Because if we're trying to learn things, we want to understand some of the best ways that we can learn them. And if we're recognizing that people have learned things that are now getting in their way, maybe impairing the way that they function, then we want to figure out how we can interfere and not have so much spontaneous recovery. So we're going to talk a little bit about phobias in regards to that, because some of the question is, why do people have phobias or an irrational fear to something? And the theory is that they have become conditioned to have a fear response to a neutral stimuli that didn't have any reason to create fear for that person. Well, see, it doesn't always explain everybody's phobic reaction. In classical conditioning, there's also this idea of higher order conditioning. So dogs are great, but we're going to talk about cats because cats are ornery. Not all cats, but a fair amount of cats. So one of the things that you can sort out with cats is that cats do know how to learn. And you may have experienced this or seen this. Certainly, cats like their food, and they will come when they know that there's food in the bowl, and they're gonna know that, oh, the bowl is there. Now I've got this conditioned response. Bowl means food. I'm gonna come and partake of my meal. We now have a pairing. Bowl is related to food. Now we have a cat who's interested in eating. So there's a pairing. But what if the cat starts making an association that the food and the bowl come out of a cupboard, and there's a squeak in the door of the cupboard? And whenever that owner goes over to that cupboard and opens the door, the cat becomes alert because maybe their food bowl and their food are coming out. Now we have what's called higher order conditioning. So there's a sequence that has been built so that the cat now has multiple steps in order to look at what could or could not be the reward that they're seeking. All of this is a part of what we call classical conditioning and can be used in what we're going to talk about later as shaping behavior to more approximations that are ideal for what that outcome is for that individual. All right, so what we want to remember when we think about classical conditioning is there's this acquisition of new associations, and then as we're recognizing that those associations aren't present anymore. For example, let's say you move the cat food and the cat bowl to someplace else, and that cupboard door doesn't have anything to do with whether the cat gets fed. Now there's an extinction of that association. However, anytime you move that cat food or that cat bowl back to that cupboard and you open the door and the cat recognizes it, you're going to have that spontaneous recovery. These are those essential things to remember about classical conditioning. All of this is under the overarching title of behaviorism. Now, we did talk in a previous chapter about John B. Watson. Watson, as you remember, had something to do with a rabbit. And actually, what Watson had to do is he wanted to understand some of those same kinds of associations. He wanted to understand how organisms learned. And one of the things he did is known as the Little Albert study. And you may have heard about this. He had a small child. There was a parent present. This is actually before ethics in research were established. And so you might look at this and go, is this ethical? And it's questionable based on the age of this little Albert. So there was a child. We don't know if his name was Albert or not, but we'll call him Albert for now. And Watson would bring out a bunny rabbit. The rabbit was white. And whenever the rabbit came out, he would, right behind Albert's head, he would clap really loud. And that would cause a startle response, so that there was an association that was learned. Every time Albert saw the rabbit, he would be startled and would become afraid. He started having a fear response to the rabbit. Then Watson started bringing in other white objects, removing the rabbit, bringing in like a white scarf, or some other thing that had a texture that might be like fur, but was not a rabbit. And what he found is that little Albert actually had generalized his fear to any white kind of furry looking prompt that made him think that this might be like that rabbit that's associated with the loud clapping sound. What we don't know about little Albert is if this fear association with white kind of furry objects lasted very much longer than that original experiment. There are a lot of fables and myths about little Albert, but actually the child that was used for this experiment was no longer tracked, and we don't know the real truth. It's unlikely at his age as a small infant that he held those associations in a real conscious form. But who knows, maybe he always had trouble sitting on Santa Claus's lap. The terminology that we get from what Watson was bringing in is also reinforced, choice of words intentional, by B.F. Skinner. Skinner gave us another way of looking at this reinforcement component. So the combination of Watson's work and Skinner's work give us the idea of reinforcement schedules and understanding that there are positive reinforcements and there are negative reinforcements into how we learn. There are also things that we understand maybe as punishments. Let's take a minute to focus in on the reinforcement component, and we'll talk about punishments a little bit later. The key component is going to be timing. So when we're thinking about these reinforcement things, what we're recognizing is if there's a behavior and then there's a consequence that's desired, say you go to work and you get a paycheck. Now you have this reward for your efforts. There's this learning that going to work has a payoff, literally, but there's a reward component to it. Additionally, if there is an undesirable consequence or the result is undesirable, we may be less likely to behave in that way. For example, if we're in an interaction with someone and we end up getting into an argument and they choose to withdraw from the conversation, maybe they storm off, like I don't talk to people who argue in those ways, that may be an undesirable consequence. And to stay in that relationship, to stay in a collaborative component may require you in that situation to change the argumentativeness in how you deal with those people. So that would be a negative consequence to behavior. And in those cases, what we see is a reduction in that behavior. So Skinner in particular, he worked with pigeons, he also worked with rats, and he created this thing called the Skinner box. What the Skinner box has is in it a lever that both the pigeon or the rat, depending on who was in this box, could press, and then pellets of food would be released. Both pigeons and rats like food, so this is a nice reward system. And so pressing the lever was something that would produce the reward. Other ways to do that would, with a negative component, could be that there may be a loud sound or even electric shock that would be present until you press the lever. And that then, pressing of the lever, reduces the negative situation. So you can have both of those components. Your alarm clock in the morning is actually a negative reinforcer. Usually we want to shut it off. And what that's telling us is we have to change our behavior to get up in the morning and do whatever we've got scheduled. So you have negative reinforcers in your life, probably on a pretty regular basis, but you probably have positive reinforcers too, such as going to the refrigerator and figure out what kind of food you like that's in the refrigerator. The good food that you looked for in there, that's your positive reinforcer for opening the refrigerator door. So let's go back to that concept of punishment. Lots of times we recognize this, we might think of it in terms of consequences for undesirable behavior. So there actually is a concept of positive punishment, and that's where something is added to decrease the likelihood of behavior. Negative punishment is when something is removed, and that is to decrease the likelihood of behavior. So if we're looking at something that is a positive punishment, think about it in certain classrooms where you might have your name put on the board if you are being called out as someone who's not participating in the way that teacher is asking. And then there might be a check put by your name every time you continue to do that behavior that that teacher is saying she wants or he wants removed. Whereas a negative punishment would be where you are told if you are behaving in this way, you're going to have a reduction in how much time you have in a certain activity, say at recess or in a class that you really desire. So that's the removal of something that is decreasing the behavior because we like that behavior. And both of those are used as ways to train individuals or keep individuals, particularly in school systems, in order to do good group behavior for the whole classroom and learning system. So recognize that there is a place for positive punishment and negative punishment. However, what we find in the research is that punishment is not nearly as effective in long-term learning as is this reinforcement. So negative and positive reinforcement is a stronger component because there's a component of motivation that gets learned within the individual. I mentioned shaping earlier. Shaping is more prominent actually in operant conditioning. So back to that Skinner box. That rat, that pigeon figured out that there was a lever that released food. Then an association was prompted between a light and the ability for food to be removed when the lever was pressed. There were actually two different colored lights or two placements on the lights, and both the rat and the pigeon began to associate that when the light would go off, or maybe there were two flashes of the light, food would be released. But if there was only one, no food would be released. After a period of time, behavior was shaped so that the pigeon or the rat would recognize, I'm not going to go push that lever until there's two lights, because that's my cue. Originally, it was the lever that was the first component that was bringing the association with food. And now it's been shaped up to watching the light flashing. And this is the way that we do more shaping. Shaping is something we use in all sorts of activities. One example would be sports. Learning how to dribble in basketball, you don't learn how to dribble while you're learning how to run and shoot the basket. You do each of those activities in separate lessons, and then you learn how to combine them slowly. So we start with one activity, and then we shape, say running, that's usually the first one, and then we learn how to dribble, and then we learn how to dribble and run at the same time. We bring the learning together, shape it into the more desirable component. We've talked a little bit about reinforcers. Want you to recognize there are primary reinforcers and there are secondary reinforcers. Primary reinforcers are going to be that reinforcer that has an innate quality of reinforcement to it. So food and water and sleep and pleasure, all of those components are going to have an innate reinforcement. We like to have our needs met. It's a satiation component that's very satisfying. Secondary reinforcers don't have any value. And actually, one that might surprise you is money. Money does not have a primary reinforcing component. What money is actually an object that we've associated some other reinforcement with, which is the freedom to maybe get water or pleasure or sleep, not sleep, to get water or food or there we go, to get what we can use that money to get things that we want, like something to drink or something to eat. At that level, money is not actually a primary reinforcer, it's a secondary reinforcer. It can certainly be a very potent reinforcer, but it's because it gives us the power to get access to some other components. And that association is something that's very complex. Recognize that a small infant does not find reinforcement from money. They have to learn that there is something about money that has value to them. And that's what happens over time. So the last aspect related to this reinforcement idea that we see in operant conditioning is to look at the scheduling. There are schedules that are fixed or they are variable. So if we go back to that light going off, it could be that the light goes off at constant intervals. And in that case, it's a fixed interval. Every 30 seconds, the light goes off. The rat or the pigeon recognizes they have to wait 30 seconds, then the light goes off, they go push the lever, and then the food comes out. Whereas a variable interval could be 10 seconds one time, 3 seconds the next time, 45 seconds. And in that case, they have to be on watch all the time because they don't know when to anticipate the cue that says it's time to get the reward. When we think about those time components, that's one of those things that we want to recognize. You probably get your paycheck when you're working in a fixed interval. It shows up every week, every couple weeks, or every month. Those are fixed intervals. Whereas if you're someone who's working on a commission basis, it's not going to show up until you've spent the time to do whatever the work is. It's a variable component that you have some control over, but it's not a fixed control over that. Additionally, there's a ratio component, like how many times does that rat or that pigeon have to push the lever to get the food? There could be an interval where it's like every fifth time the food comes down, or it could be a ratio. It's like one time it's like 3 times, another time it may be 10 or 15. What we do know, the most intense learning is going to come from a variable ratio, where you don't know how many times and you don't know how many times you have to do the behavior before you can get the reward. Now, I don't know what comes to mind when you think of that, but I want to point out one of the ways that psychology has actually shown up in a lot of different situations to inform how things have been built. Casinos and gambling in particular are built on a variable ratio pattern. So if you think specifically about a slot machine, it's not clear if it's how much time you sit at the slot machine, or if it's how much money you put into the slot machine, or how many times you push the button or pull the lever on the slot machine. What we know is that it will take all of those, and you never know when or if a reward is going to come. This is why it is so addictive for so many people, because the thrill of anticipation and not knowing. If you knew that every time you put in 50 coins, you were gonna get a reward, well, first of all, everyone would do it, and the casinos wouldn't make any money, and you would not do anything until it was time for that 50th time. You know, just go quickly do it and move on. And that also is the case with time. If you just have to be there after 15 minutes, you go at that last period of time, and then it's time for that reward to come. So when we want to have behavior where there's a lot of attention, a lot of focus, anticipation, what we're really looking at is variable ratio reinforcement schedules. And slot machines are a great example.